call Dennis O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. At the first reading, I said New Zealand First would support this bill because there is a need for a strong deterrence to offenders who exploit children. And I would have to disagree with Mr Clendon on this. He says that longer sentences don't necessarily deter offenders. To that I would say that shorter sentences certainly don't deter them either. The point here is that the deterrence must be sufficient to deal with the crime. And I don't think in this bill that they necessarily are, but I'll come to that in a moment. New Zealand First still welcomes the provisions in the bill which clarify some of the offences covered by the relevant legislation and which widen the net to catch a greater range of the people involved. And I still welcome the increases in the penalties, some of which are being doubled and others added. But we now find that the bill is defective in several ways, to the extent that while there is much good in it, it can no longer be supported by New Zealand First. Part 1 no longer lives up to New Zealand First's expectations concerning the Films, Videos and Publications Act 1993. Clause 4 increases the penalty from 10 to 14 years for supplying or distributing objectionable material. The offence needs an especially strong deterrence and the increase is appropriate, but the offence covers distribution by an offender to any other person or other persons generally. New Zealand First believes that there should be a further special provision where the offence is against children under the age of 16, and we reject the arguments which were advanced by officials against doing this. The amendment should instruct the court that where the offence is against children under 16, then that is an aggravating factor, ensuring that the penalty would be imposed at the upper end of the possible 14 years of imprisonment scale. We don't accept that it should be left to the court to achieve this by way of its general discretion. We want it to be mandatory, and that's the principal reason why New Zealand First will now oppose this bill. It just doesn't go far enough. Clause 5 relates to the offence of possession of objectionable material, and subclause 5.3 inserts a new section into the relevant act which solves evidential problems, widens the net to catch more of the people involved, especially proof of possession where electronic means are used, so that it won't be necessary to prove an offender has saved an electronic instrument, and there will be no need to prove any intention of doing so. That we think is appropriate and necessary. Otherwise, the evidential burden would be too severe because electronic material clearly has to be searched or at least knowingly accepted. Otherwise, the offender couldn't, in practice, obtain it. Clause 6 relates to offences of possession of objectionable publications, knowing or having reasonable cause to believe that the publications are objectionable. The penalties are increased from imprisonment not exceeding 5 years to one of not exceeding 10 years, or to a fine not exceeding $50,000. But this amendment, we think, should also say both, so that both the imprisonment and fine penalties can be imposed. And the fine is far too light. It should be increased to at least $100,000. And the reason for that, Mr Speaker, is that some people make a lot of money out of these offences, and the deterrence, the fine and the possible imprisonment sentence need to be severe, especially the fine. So that's just too light, we think. Clause 7 inserts an important new section 132B, which contains a presumption of imprisonment for repeat offenders who have been convicted of one or more specified publications offences. And these include offences for the sexual exploitation of children. The offender must be sentenced to for their repeat offence to a sentence of imprisonment unless the court considers that the offender should not be so sentenced, having regard to particular circumstances, and that could include his or her age if he or she is under 20 years. These new provisions, Mr Speaker, are appropriate and would be quite acceptable to New Zealand First, and they are the sorts of sentences that are needed to break a cycle of offending, because some of these people become addictive, or for others the financial rewards are just too seductive. So those sentences are satisfactory. Concerning the amendments to the Customs and Excise Act 1996, clause 10.1 relates to being knowingly concerned in the importation of an objectionable publication, films, videos and such like. The amendment increases the maximum term of imprisonment from 5 to 10 years, and again, New Zealand First sees that as appropriate. Part 2, concerning the amendments related to indecency, however, no longer live up to New Zealand First's expectations. Clause 13 creates a new offence of indecent communication with a young person under the age of 16 years. A person of or over the age of 16 years is liable to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 3 years if he or she intentionally exposes a person under the age of 16 years to indecent material in communicating in any manner with the young person. Now, while New Zealand First fully supports that new offence, we do not think that a maximum of 3 years in prison is anywhere near adequate. Now, compare that sentence with those which I've just mentioned for other offences being increased from 5 to 10 years and in one case to 14 years. These offences are not very different in nature, and for this particular offence to specify a maximum of 3 years is clearly, in our view, grossly inadequate. And this is the kind of provision that needs to deter the sorts of activity that we saw with the roast busters. Pretty disgusting stuff. Those people need to be sent a very clear signal, and if they persist in that sort of an offence, they should look forward to a sentence in some cases where it's justified well over 3 years, and in fact probably well over 5 years, if there is going to be an effective deterrence. So, Mr Speaker, while there is so much to be commended in the bill, and I've mentioned some of those, there are also far too many inadequacies to enable New Zealand First to support the bill overall. And I've also mentioned some of those inadequacies. We think in the end that the bill is just too weak to ensure that where the offences are against children, the penalties for offenders must be at the high end of or close to the maximum. Otherwise, people who are addicted by these activities or just make a huge amount of money from them won't be adequately deterred, and that of course is what the objective is. So, Mr Speaker, New Zealand First, for those reasons, can no longer support the bill.